myself here for this. Anyway, howdy. I'm Lorraine Eden. I'm Professor Emerita of the Management Department. After this is my 25th year at Texas A&M. And I'm also, I've got a funny title of something like Research Professor of Law in the law school, very much courtesy of Professor Burns here. I thought it might be helpful if I just tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll move into the case. I got into transfer. Matter of fact, if you listen to the podcast that on the Fiona show that's up now, that was recorded in Scottsdale, Arizona, the first week in December. I'm interviewed on that on the arm's length standards, not the problem question. It talks a little bit about my history there too. I fell into transfer pricing just a fluke. I was looking for a PhD dissertation chair. Approached a public finance specialist and was going to write in externalities. And he said, no, Carl Schaup's just retired from Columbia. He's coming to Dalhousie for a year. I think he should chair your dissertation. And in those days, people wrote letters. So he wrote to Carl. Carl wrote back and said, I'll take Lorraine on if and only if she writes on transfer pricing. So, the question was, did I or didn't I? And I'm kind of one of these believers that when the brass rung comes across, you can either grab it or not grab it. And I grabbed it and decided to write with Carl. And I think in many ways that's made all the difference in my own career. So I've been doing this stuff for 45 years now, I guess. It's old. I'm probably doing it longer than you are all alive now. I come back and forth to it sometimes. I've done a lot of other stuff, but it really is the intellectual love of my life, if that makes any sense. I have put more than my proverbial 100,000 hours into it. I've probably put a million hours into studying transfer pricing over those last 45 years. What I'm working on now is I'm really very upset by Pillar 1. Those of you, particularly Pramod, who was in the class last year in Nabil, would have listened to me ranting about Pillar 1 and have been writing about it. Had a piece on Pillar 2 just in Bloomberg Tax. Both of those pieces are up on the SSRN and are hitting top 10 lists on SSRN over and over again. So clearly they're being picked up and read elsewhere. The next one I'm going to write is being called The Risky Business of Formulary Apportionment. So I have a title, I have the materials, it's all the negative. Don't go there, right, on formulary apportionment. So that's my next topic on here. Let me say I have been teaching transfer pricing at Texas A&M since 2007. My class was always an introductory one. In other words, it was people who had never had any transfer pricing before at all and who were looking to get into a career in transfer pricing. Every once in a while, I would have someone who had actually done it as part of a job but wanted more background. So Daniela, for example, in Columbia in the law as a lawyer, and had some experience with transfer pricing before she came to the Bush School. But it is rare that I had students who knew anything until they actually got in the door. You're a very different group. You've been, many of you, working for some time in transfer pricing. So my own concern about talking to you is that I'm going to pitch this too low. So what I need you to do is, when you're getting bored because you think I already know this stuff, will you raise your hand and say, I'm bored? And so that you can ask me more difficult questions. And matter of fact, one of the things I thought about was, given that you know these things, should I even bother talking? And then I thought, there is some usefulness in having a structure here. So what I want to do is go over my own idiosyncratic structure of thinking about transfer pricing, in particular the cup, but more generally 482 and the arm's length standard and all that. And Daniela will have heard this before, so this will be refresher for Daniela. But hopefully this structure and the way I think about it may be helpful for yourself. As I said before, I think you can learn some lessons from transfer pricing cases, but they are kind of one-offs depending upon the judge. And so I think the real, my own personal understanding comes from a very different place than this. Now, I know you're all lawyers, or you're going to go, you're getting degrees in jurisprudence, but my background is in economics, and I come at this straight from mainstream rational economics. And I want to start there with you on this. So my intention is to basically talk for, I don't know, a half an hour, shall we say, about this. Stop me at any time if you're lost or you have questions on this. I'll kind of try to track in the order of the readings. And then what I want to do is, we just have a general discussion. And then the case, the Hoffer case, we'll leave for Wednesday. And I'll come back to that when we get there. So let me start with an overview. I always start teaching the transfer pricing class with the discussion of what a multinational enterprise is and what international business strategy is, for example. So I think it's important, if you're interested in transfer pricing, to understand the entity that's actually doing it, which is the multinational enterprise. Now, economists look at M&Es in a very different way than business professors, and I usually spend 1 week doing the way economists look at it and another week the way accountants and management and finance professors look at the multinational, because they are different, but inform each other. Here we got limited time, so I am only going to talk to you the way economists do this, and I'm going all the way back really to the 70s. In terms of the original formulations of how this was done. And you know economics is parsimonious. It treats the firm as a black box. It really narrows things down to just try to get at the essence of what's going on here. So in other words, if I want to understand transfer pricing, which is how you set the prices between related party transactions, okay? The economist will tell you, you need to start from saying, who's the entity that's making the decision? It's the multinational. What's the simplest way we conceive of a multinational? And the very simplest way you conceive of it is it's a firm that makes stuff in 2 locations and it sells in 2 locations, okay? So it makes in country A and country B, and it sells in country A and country B is the very simplest thing. So it's got actually 2 physical plants that make an output and 2 physical countries or markets where it sells. So the whole discussion is about plants and markets, right? 2 plants, 2 markets, split by a border between them at some distance apart between the 2 of them. The assumption is these 2 are both wholly owned. One could be a parent and the other a sub, or they could be 2 subsidiaries and the parent is somewhere else, doesn't matter. But the idea here is that the 2 of these jointly maximize profits together. So they collude. So the underlying assumption behind transfer pricing is collusion between the buyer and the seller, because the 2 of them are related and they know that 2 is stronger than 1. In other words, the sum, the whole, is greater than the sum of the parts. That's the underlying sort of #1 thing that drives this, is they're together, they're jointly owned or jointly controlled. Together they collude, and they collude to maximize profits of the group, even if one of them loses and the other one gains. Overall, the net gain is positive for the group, and the one that loses somehow is okay with this. Why that, the politics of this are a little strange, but the economics is, even if one entity loses, as long as the other one gains more, welfare goes up. So the underlying assumption in economists really was that this was good. that what a multinational does when it transfer prices is it's setting prices based on resource allocation decisions. It's transferring stuff to where it's made the cheapest and where it sells the most, where it gets the lowest cost and the highest reward, so it maximizes the gap between revenues and expenditures, right? So this is a good thing. It's based on straightforward comparative advantage. It came straight out of Ricardo and Adam Smith in international trade theory. And seriously, when I first started learning about how economists view multinational enterprises, my response was, holy crow, this is Adam Smith, 1776. It really, truly is. So the idea is then these two plants, you want to shift stuff to the low-cost market. You want to shift stuff to the place where it sells the most, and you maximize the gap between the summed revenues and the summed costs, which gives you the biggest profits. When you do this, what you discover is the shadow price, what economists call the shadow price, which is the Lagrangian constraint that everything that is sold has to be bought, right? The shadow price on the related party transaction is the marginal cost of the exporting firm. Bottom line, the very first thing that plunks out of any of this is what should be the efficient transfer price, which is called the shadow price. It's the marginal cost of the exporting firm. Done, right? In a world where there was no government, where there was no external market, how would a multinational enterprise transfer price? It would set price at the marginal cost of the exporting firm. And that's the sort of first, it's not even rule of thumb, it's a first true statement for economists in thinking about transfer pricing. If I were to ask economists what should be the transfer price that is the most efficient transfer price, they would say the marginal cost of the exporting firm, right? Because the alternative is to sell it locally. So you have the choice of selling it outside or selling it inside, making it outside or making it inside. And at the margin, that's the marginal cost of the exporting firm. Done. So that's the first statement that economists tell you about transfer pricing. Second statement is, okay, what if there is an external market? Suppose there is one. And the same, Adam Smith kicks in again, David Ricardo kicks in again. They both told you if the price outside the country was different, the country should use that price because they gained competitive advantage by doing so. The law of comparative advantage that you would have learned in Economics 100, way back when you took Ec 100, told you that. Still true for economists when they look at the multinational. If there is an external market price, the firm should use it. That I called Hirschleifer's rule. And the reason why I called it that is because the guy who did the first proof of it was a guy called Jack Hirschleifer. He published it in the Journal of Business in 1956, and I stuck it up online so that you could see it if you want to read it. It really, truly is a seminal piece in the transfer pricing, literature. It is. So that what he proved was it didn't matter if the external market price was higher than the marginal cost of the exporting firm, you'd use it, you'd sell outside. If the external price was low, you would buy from the outside, just like David Ricardo, all right? No change in what Smith and Ricardo told us. If there is an external price, use it. Well, that I call Hirschleifer's rule, but it is also the arm's length standard. The arm's length standard says if you're trying to figure out the transfer price between a transaction between two related parties, look to see what the external market price would have been under the exact same set of facts and circumstances. All right, so let me pick up. So the second point then is, I said Jack Hirschleifer proved the seminal finding that if there is an external market price, the multinational on its own volition, in order to maximize its own global profits, will use it. And I think most people do not realize that. Do not realize that even if there weren't any government, the firm would follow the arm's length standard. And to me, that's a really core part of understanding the arm's length standard, is that the firm itself in basic microeconomics would apply the arm's length standard on its own volition because it maximizes its own profits. All right. Now, so CUP and the arm's length standard, or maybe I should say the arm's length standard and then CUP, which is its closest manifestation, are based on this Hirschleifer's rule. And it applies, you know, there's nothing that says it's specific to goods. It can be used for services. It can be used for financial transactions. You know, the underlying assumption is that economics tells you firms maximize profits doing this. Now, okay, the devil's in the details. Third statement. Third statement says, what do you do if there is a government? Well, of course, the problem is when there is a government, then there are incentives to jack up or lower the transfer price. You know, you want to avoid paying customs duties. If there's differences in taxes between the two locations, you want to take advantage of them. And so the firm has an incentive to move the transfer price away from the external market price if in doing so its after-tax profits are greater. And so the arm's length standard I think of is sort of almost sort of hitting you on the hand and saying, no, 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 not, you know, naughty boy, you're supposed to be following the rule which says in a world of no government and none of these impediments, how would you set the transfer price for most efficient resource allocation? You would have set it at the external market price if it existed, remember, because it's got to exist. Or if it didn't exist, you would have set it at the marginal cost of the exporting firm, all right? So even if there is no external market price, transfer pricing economics tells you use the marginal cost of the exporting firm as the alternative price. And I think people who criticize the arm's length standard really truly forget that. There's two parts here. One, if there is an external price, use it. And two, if there isn't an external price, use marginal cost of the exporting firm. Now, there's a third piece to that, which says, okay, what if there's something wrong with the external market price? And we know there often is. It's not that it doesn't exist. It does exist, but there's a problem with it, okay? Markets are thin, so that you only have a couple of transactions. The transfer price is a posted price, not a real price. Okay, it's distorted in some way, shape, or form. Well, the interesting thing is that Hirschleifer worked through that case too, and the economics of that shows you the price you pick should be somewhere between the two. You should pick a price between the external market price and the marginal cost of the exporting firm, which is kind of interesting. And there he says to actually figure it out, you really need to know the shapes of the demand and supply curves. In other words, you really, truly need to understand the facts and circumstances. Well, isn't that cool? Because we know in the real world, the prices are distorted. Maybe they do exist, but they're not close comparables. Even basic economics tells us in that case, you can get to a right answer by looking at the facts and circumstances of the case, or as right as you're going to get in this crazy world that we live in today, right? I mean, you're never going to get 100%. At the very best, you're going to get within some arm's length range of what you think is the best price. Now, Hirschleifer said there's several problems. There's several possible caveats, and I've just told you one. There's a problem with the external market price. It's there, but it isn't a very good price. It's not a good signal of what open market pricing is. Lots of those prices aren't very good. Could there be something else that would screw this up? And the answer is absolutely. There is another problem that could happen, and that's inside the firm, inside the multinational. The problem's not with the open market price. The problem is inside the multinational. And that problem is interdependencies on either supply side or the demand side. So for example, suppose you had interdependencies between the buyer and the seller on the supply side. Economies of scale and scope is an obvious one. Pooling economies. Suppose you had some interdependencies on the demand side. The one we normally think of is joint products. You know, when you get oil out of the ground, out comes natural gas too, right? And you got tied sales, the size of the oil and the natural gas. Well, there's a very interesting discussion too in two Hirschleifer papers, one in 67, the other one in 68, I think, or 57, that's 57, 58, with a lot of very complicated mathematics that basically say when you got interdependencies in the demand or the supply side, you got problems. You can't, it's not the marginal cost of the exporter, it's not the open market price. Again, it's somewhere in between based on the facts and circumstances. Now, does that matter? Absolutely. Because if you think about a lot of the stuff that is written in the transfer pricing guidelines, the OEC in particular, and now in the UN manual, what are they worrying about? They're worrying about synergies. They're worrying about hubs, right? They're worrying about marketing hubs, procurement policies. The new finance chapter has just come out. And the question is, do you need to worry about the shadow of the group? And then you got a slightly less interest rate because you were part of a group. And there's all this discussion about passive association and active association, right? What is that? That's Hirschleifer talking to you about interdependencies on the supply side and the demand side and whether they should be taken into account on the transfer pricing. And the economists will tell you, yes, the transfer price for efficient resource allocation needs to take account of these. Now, having said that, that's not what the 482 says, nor what the OECD guidelines says, which talks about passive versus active association. Passive you ignore, active you need to take some into account. But I'm just a sort of look ahead. So for me, as an economist who started out here, when I started out learning transfer pricing, I read the original Tom Horst article in 1972, I guess it was, which was about how tariffs and taxes distort transfer pricing. And I read the two Jack Hirschleifer ones about how an economist would set transfer prices. So for me, I think it's important to know, even before there were any rules, you could talk about how an economist, how a firm should set prices for related party transactions in it. And I think it's important to know it's any organization that has two divisions or is in two locations. In my class, I would talk about Texas A&M, and I talked about myself on a regular basis. Daniela will remember this. I'm in the management department. My field is not a field that's normally taught in management. When I was teaching a transfer pricing class, I had overall, the 10 years I taught transfer pricing, or 12 years I taught transfer pricing. You know how many management students I had in my class? 0. Oh, never had a management student ever take a transfer pricing class from me, even though I was in a management department. So why did my department let me teach transfer pricing primarily to Bush School students and then to economic students and then finally to finance and accounting students? They demanded a payment from the Bush School. And the Bush School regularly paid a % of my salary to the management department to get me out of teaching management courses. So I'm an example of a related party transaction within Texas A&M. Isn't that interesting? Hospitals do transfer pricing. Anytime you've got one division of a hospital and something is moved from one place to another, it has to be priced inside. It doesn't have to be through a multinational enterprise. The principles, the economic principles that underlie related party transactions are as true within a university in one location as they are within a hospital, as they are within a not-for-profit like Red Cross, for example, as they are within a multinational enterprise. And so for me as an economist, deep down in my gut, I have this understanding of what transfer pricing is really, truly all about. And when I come to the table as an expert witness, thinking about what the transfer price should be, this is where I start from. I start from where the price would be here. And then I will go to the regs. my impression is most people start and just simply try to apply the regs without having any understanding of what they're doing at all. And I think the regs, they're helpful, but they can be read in multiple ways, and better to have a core understanding of what's going on than to just sort of blindly follow the regs in some sense, particularly as an expert witness in sort of high-profile court cases where the judges know the regs, right, or supposed to know the regs, and you're there to explain the economics of why this should be what it should be here. Okay, so let me move from there then to 482. And that simplest thing for me is to grab my copy of the 482 and, you know, this thing. And I just want to walk through and make sure, I mean, you would have done this, so I don't need to go anywhere. I'm going to start way over on sort of, I guess, 18. You know the 482 arm's length standard, right? You've done that in class. You would have been familiar with it. And you understand what it is. It says the standard is the hypothetical of what two unrelated parties would have done under the same F&C, facts and circumstances. I used to call this the weed standard, which is what would independent enterprises do. In other words, you had this transaction between two related parties. The arm's length standard says, okay, take this transaction between two related and look what two unrelated parties would have done if they had been in exactly the same set of facts and circumstances here, right? There are two kinds of these, and you would have looked at these, I'm sure you're aware of these already, what are called internal comparables and external comparables. Internal comparables are, in my view, by far the best. If you can find a good internal comparable, hands down, you're done. You know, just go with that good internal comparable. And the other thing I can tell you is many firms have no idea they have internal comparables, right? They just don't know. Now, when George Salas comes and teaches next week, ask him this question, please. Does he think with the big data coming in now, and in particular with blockchain coming in, it will be easier for firms to find their own internal comparables? I think it's probably true that with blockchain coming in and much better big data, a firm will be able to cut through and find whether or not there are sufficiently similar transactions on the inside that could be used for an internal comparable. External comparables, I mean, that's where you go if you have to go. You go to look out and see, you know, you go to the London Metal Exchange and you look up the prices. You go and see what the current price is for crude oil of specialty whatever being sold from this state-owned enterprise to this entity, right? So you can go for an external comparable if you have to. It's a whole lot harder. And so my recommendation has always been that firms should look inside. And you as lawyers or working with anyone, or if you're working for a big four firm, you should really go and hammer at that firm to find its internal comparables on here, because they probably do exist in close enough form. And I don't care if it's a good or a service or it's an intangible, you can probably find a starting point with an internal comparable if you can get your hands on one. Okay. Then once you've got this external and internal, if you've got this external and internal comparable here, what you need to do is adjust it. And 482 tells you in slide, 22, you need to get what we used to call the MRML, the most reliable measure of an arm's length result. Mr. MRML, I used to call this. There used to be a hierarchy among the methods. Cup came first, not true anymore. The key things, according to 482, that determine what's the most reliable measure of an arm's length result is how comparable the transactions are and the actual the thing that's being transferred, the transactions and the parties are, and then basically the amount and quality of the data that you have on them. And the third one, which is the assumption. So I want to stop you here and let's talk about these things. First thing from MRML, most reliable measure of an arm's length result, is comparability. I'll talk about comparability in a minute. The second thing is the quality and the quantity of the data. This is what we call the evidence. Matter of fact, I'm writing a paper right now as we speak on evidence-based policymaking, on what is good evidence to be used in policymaking. Here's a straight example out of 482. You need comparability, then you need your evidence. Economists want good evidence here. The third thing is assumptions, and nobody understands what assumptions mean. So I'm going to stop you here and let's talk a little bit about what assumptions mean. For me, the assumptions mean, what's the story you're going to tell about this related party transaction? Is the seller a contract manufacturer or a full-fledged manufacturer? Is the buyer a contract distributor or a full-fledged distributor? How closely are they related? Where is the bargaining power here? Is it on the buyer side? Is it on the seller side? All right? In other words, the assumptions you bring to the table will color what you pick as the method here. If I believe the manufacturer is a contract manufacturer, I'm going to push one way on the transfer price. If I believe it's a contract distributor, I'm going to push a very different way on the transfer price. So key for an economist coming in to apply 482 is getting a real true handle on comparability. You got to do that first. That's your facts and circumstances. Second is getting that really high quality evidence to back up those facts and circumstances, and then you put the evidence together with the comparability and you tell your story. That's your assumptions about who these related parties are and what this transaction is and what that story is. So I've read, I don't know, dozens of contemporaneous documentation packages over my consulting career. They all tell a story, some much better than others. And if you want to convince a tax authority, you want to convince a judge, key to that is how you tell that story. So I tell my students, you need to marshal up your data. You need to get all your comparability facts together. You need to have that really good evidence. But then key is your ability to write. You have to be able to tell a story that makes sense to a tax authority, to your client, to your judge. And if you can do that well, you can win. So the other thing I would tell my students is the ability to win here depends upon how good you are at negotiating and telling a story. So I used to send my students off regularly to go do a negotiations class, because I knew that if you were going to go into court or you were going to go before a tax authority, you needed to have all of this at your fingertips. You needed not only the content, you need to have the facts and circumstances, you need to have all the evidence, you need the process, which is you've got to be able to tell a really good, convincing story about why you believe this is the way this should be done. And so that little paragraph in 482, which tells you the things you need, for me is a very pragmatic view of what economists bring to the table here. They come to the table, if they're good at all, they know how to do a comparability analysis. They know where to go and get the evidence and how to do the statistics to show that evidence. And third, they know how to tell a convincing story. If any of those three things falls apart, I don't think you win in front of a judge, in front of a tax authority, and you can't even convince your own client. So if you have any, another takeaway I have from this class is focus on that paragraph. Bring to everything you do in transfer pricing those three things: a focus on comparability, a focus on evidence, and a focus on assumptions, on telling a good story. I think if you can do those three things well, you will win in transfer pricing. If you're an in-house transfer pricing expert, for Ford or Toyota, You can get access to this information more easily than the rest of us because you get the inside data. You then need to tell that story, not only to convince outsiders, you need to tell that story to convince your insiders. You've got to go to talk to those managers and say, I want you to use this kind of transfer pricing method, and here's the reason why you're going to do it. And they have to believe you, right? So knowing how to do that is a very important part, I think, of being a very successful transfer pricing professional. We're in my PowerPoint, slide 24, I'll hold it up for you. Slide 24 in my PowerPoint on the 482. You notice there's a fourth on the list down the bottom, which is confirmation by another method, which is nice. Again, a good economist will always do sensitivity testing and to see whether you get confirmation by doing it a different way. In other words, when you read a journal article, they will say use, I don't know, OLS, shall we say, as the econometric technique. But then they will run it using some other kind of method afterwards as confirmation. So again, a good economist will double check, right? Double check by using another method if you can. So if two methods give you the same result, you've got more reliability here. Sorry, I forgot that on here. Okay. Let me move in. I want to talk briefly about slide 26 down there in slide 26 down there in the bottom. The key question is here is, or has anybody else got any questions for me before I keep going? Right. The key question on comparability is what's enough, right? You're never going to get 100%. So the question is, again, you've got to tell a good enough story that the ones you have are enough. They are sufficient, right? That you feel confident within a 95% confidence interval that you've got the right transfer price that meets 482 or any of the other country restrictions and what meets the arm's length standard. And the question is, normally you're not going to find it. I think you're going to get it closest with an internal comparable, for the reasons I've mentioned before. But if you don't get it, what's the question about how do you make the decision? The way that it is made when you have what's called an inexact comparable, all right, is to say, are there differences between the related party transaction and the unrelated party transaction? And the answer is yes. And then the question is, are they material or not? All right? Material differences must be controlled for. So the question is, are there material differences? Now the question is, what's material mean? Material means they affect the bottom line of your profitability. So you could have a difference, but it's not material. Say on a $10 price, it's a penny. Who cares about a penny on a $10 price? Not you, not me. But if it's a $10 price and it affects it by $5, that's material, right? So the question is, you know you're going to have to make adjustments. The question is, are those adjustments material? So if they are material, you must make them, or this is not an appropriate method to use for the transfer price, right? It just isn't very good. You got a really lousy transfer price. But if it's material and you can fix it, you can estimate how to fix it, then you can use it. So one of the things I think when you're going up before a judge, I think economists don't do very well, is judges think they're going to get these perfect comparables. So you need, as an economist or as a lawyer going in there and making the case, you need to talk to the judge and say, I know we don't have exact comparables here, and I either believe the problems are non-material so we can safely ignore them, it's 1 penny on $10, or they are material, but guess what? I know how to fix them. I know how to figure out what they're worth. So for example, foreign exchange risks may be involved. I've got some foreign exchange exposure, transaction exposure, shall we say. Can I quantify what I would have bought insurance when I hedged to cover me for that FX exposure? Yes. Suppose I need a warranty. Can I quantify what that warranty would have cost me in the open market? Yes. So if I have material things that matter and I can adjust for them, make the adjustments and then say, I have a good cup. I have a good cup because I have been able to control for material differences. If you can't, then walk away. And that's a reason to dump the cup and go to a different method.